Welcome to This Explainer. There's a really fascinating paradox right at the heart of modern democracies. We usually think that just writing down a bunch of rules in a constitution is the finish line, right? Boom, you've built a nation. But here's the thing, and this is absolutely the core thesis of what we're looking at today. Having federalism written into a constitution is completely necessary, for sure, but its true success, that relies entirely on how it's actually practiced.
So, are constitutional rules enough? Spoiler alert, no, they're not. You can have the most beautifully written constitution on the planet, cleanly carving up powers between a union and its states. But honestly, rules on paper mean absolutely nothing without the living, breathing practice of democratic politics to back them up, to test them, and to actually respect them. The real success of federalism in India, which is literally one of the world's most complex democracies, wasn't just guaranteed by ink on a page. It was forged through some seriously intense political trials.
Today, we're going to examine three massive litmus tests that shaped how India actually practices power sharing. We'll look at Trial 1, Linguistic States, Trial 2, Language Policy, and finally, Trial 3, Center-State Relations.
Let's jump right into Trial 1, redrawing the lines.
Imagine waking up in a newly independent country back in 1947, only to realize that the internal borders drawn by your former colonial rulers completely ignore the realities of the people actually living there. Wild, right? The radical decision to reorganize a country of this size was the very first major test for Indian democratic practice. From 1947 to 2017, it's like a giant puzzle was taken apart and put back together. Ancient states vanished, new ones popped up, and boundaries were totally overhauled. The guiding principle for this massive reshuffle? Language. The goal was simply to ensure that people who spoke the same language lived in the same state, creating what we now call linguistic states.
But, language wasn't the only metric. While the first linguistic state, Andhra Pradesh, was created in 1953 after a massive movement for a Telugu-speaking state, the logic of federalism had to stretch a bit further. States like Nagaland, Uttarakhand, and Jharkhand, they were carved out specifically to recognize unique cultures, ethnicities, or even distinct geography, rather than just language alone. Basically, federalism in practice had to adapt to multiple layers of identity. Now, when the demand for these specific states first started bubbling up, national leaders were terrified, like genuinely terrified. They dragged their feet and resisted this division for a long time. They were so worried that giving linguistic groups their own states would just spark separatism and literally tear this newly formed nation apart. But you know what happened? Experience showed the exact opposite. Carving out these states actually made the country more united. It removed a huge source of friction and made day-to-day administration way easier. The democratic gamble totally paid off.
Moving on to Trial 2, the Tower of Babel. Okay, so you've survived redrawing the borders. Awesome. But how do you survive the tension of having literally no single unifying national language? This was the second massive litmus test, the language policy. Now, you might assume that a country needs one national language to function properly. But in India, Hindi, which is identified as the official language, is the mother tongue of only about 40% of the population. Think about that. That leaves a whopping 60% of citizens who speak other languages. If a central government just tried to force Hindi on everybody, it would be an absolute administrative and social disaster. They desperately needed constitutional safeguards. And that brings us to a really, really important number, 22. Because India deliberately does not have one designated national language, the Constitution recognizes 22 different languages as scheduled languages. So what does this actually look like in practice? Well, it means if you're taking a central government exam, you can literally choose to write it in any of these 22 languages. Plus, individual states have the full autonomy to pick their own official languages for their internal government work. Of course, the internal pushback during all this was fierce. While some folks demanded the exclusive use of Hindi, citizens in other regions were like, hold on, why Hindi? Why not Bangla or Telugu? Fun fact, according to the original Constitution, the use of English for official purposes was actually supposed to end in 1965, but many non-Hindi-speaking states fiercely demanded that English stick around. So, how did India handle it? They went with a flexible compromise. They agreed to keep using English as an associate official language, right alongside Hindi. To put that into perspective, just look at Sri Lanka. In 1956, they passed a super rigid act recognizing only Sinhala as the official language, which completely alienated their Tamil speakers. India's flexible, accommodating approach, even if it was a bit cautious, actively prevented the kind of severe national crisis and civil conflict that Sri Lanka unfortunately fell into. It turns out, compromise is the ultimate survival mechanism in federalism. Which brings us to Trial 3, the powers struggle. We've talked about borders and we've talked about languages, but the final and honestly most crucial test of a federal system is the day-to-day practice of sharing actual political power. For a long time after independence, the dynamic was pretty skewed. State representatives were essentially lining up with metaphorical bowls, begging for power and resources from a dominant central figure. Because the same political party ruled at the center and in most of the states, state governments didn't really get to exercise their rights as autonomous units. And if a rival party did happen to win a state, the central government would frequently just misuse constitutional provisions to dismiss them arbitrarily. It was a massive hit to the whole spirit of federalism. But as we know, democratic systems evolve. That pre-1990s era of central dominance eventually began to crack. The 1990s brought a massive structural shift in Indian politics, mostly driven by the rapid rise of regional political parties. States were finally finding their own unique political voices. And this culminated in a post-1990s era that totally flipped the center-state dynamic on its head, thanks to two major forces: the absolute necessity of coalition governments and some very crucial interventions by the Supreme Court. Let's break down this shift, starting with coalition governments. Basically, a coalition is formed when at least two political parties come together, usually adopting a common program. This became huge because suddenly no single national party could secure a clear majority in the Lok Sabha, the lower house of parliament. They had no choice. To form a central government at all, major national parties were forced to enter into alliances with a bunch of regional parties. All of a sudden, the leader of the coalition is sitting on this precarious seat of fire, desperately trying to keep all these diverse regional partners happy. It's an incredibly delicate, stressful balancing act. But, and here's the kicker, this very vulnerability had a phenomenal side effect. Because the central government's sheer survival now depended on regional parties, it fostered a brand new culture of power sharing. It essentially forced a profound structural respect for state autonomy that just wasn't there before. And this new political reality was quickly backed up by the law. The Supreme Court of India stepped in and laid down strict guidelines, making it incredibly difficult for the central government to just arbitrarily dismiss state governments. They firmly protected state autonomy. Because of this powerful one-two punch of coalition politics and judicial protection, federal power sharing is actually way more effective today than it was in the early years of the Republic. The old era of central dominance? It's largely a thing of the past. So what should you take away from all of this? Well, the biggest takeaway is that federalism is absolutely not just a static legal document sitting in a vault somewhere. It is a living, breathing practice of power sharing and mutual respect. The Indian federal experiment survived its three major tests: redrawing linguistic borders, navigating a really complex language policy, and balancing center-state power, not simply because the Constitution allowed it, but because the messy, flexible, and accommodating nature of democratic politics allowed the system to bend instead of breaking. Which leaves us with a huge question for the future. As our societies become increasingly complex and diverse, how will modern democracies continue to balance the need for strong central authority with the loud, undeniable demands of regional identity? The trials of federalism are never truly over. They just take on new forms. Keep this in mind the next time you see regional and national politics clashing in the headlines. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.